for that introduction. I am very delighted to be here in Konkan University. I believe you call it KKU. Let me give you a little bit of an idea of what I do. I am the publisher for some pure mathematics journals at Elsevier, and I have been doing this for the last 17 years. So in that time, I have also worked with economics and econometrics journals, and now the last 2 years specifically with mathematics. So I will, sorry? So this is a small overview of what I will be discussing today. As you can see, I will first discuss the country, so Thailand in general, how you are doing in the research area, in the international research arena. Then I will look at Konkan University and how Konkan is currently doing academically. I will give you a little bit of an idea of what Elsevier does, a little bit of history from the company. Then the major part, the largest part of the presentation is about how to get published in an internationally renowned journal. And there's a couple of steps that I would like to take to give you a better idea of how to position your research in the best possible way and be successful in, with your research in international environment. And then last but not least, what not to do. This is more on the ethics and unethical side of the publishing process. So this is gives you an idea of the current articles published in Right now, is this working? That's much better. So, as I was saying, these are the articles currently published in Thailand in international journals worldwide. There is close to 10,000 articles that were published in 2011. And you can see that this is rapidly growing, so I expect that about maybe 10 to 12% increase year on year now. So you're rapidly becoming more internationally recognized for your research, which is great. Internationally, the collaboration you do is, as you can see here, in 2011, about 40% of all the articles published were with an international or with an author outside of Thailand. So you're collaborating with a lot of people around the world, and this is also really high when you compare this, for example, to the US, where in the United States about 25% is only collaborated with other researchers around the world. So I think this is really nice to look at. Then you see the cited and uncited documents here, and I hope this part of the audience can see this as well. You see that after 2 years, about 30%, 25 to 30% has already been cited. That's also great. Of course, you want to get your article cited by as many people around the world as possible. Here you have citations and self-citations, so the citations that other people make to your articles versus the citations you make to your own research. That is also quite impressive because only about 15% of the citations that are given to an article are to your own work. So you tend to cite other people more often and less your own work, which is something admirable as well. So, breakdown of the subject areas that are currently published in Thailand. I think it's a nice representation of all the different areas that you focus on. Your very particular strengths are, of course, engineering and the medical specialties, as well as chemistry. But I think you're represented in each and every field quite well. This is a representation of Khon Kaen University and the strengths that the university has specifically. You can see this ring, and you can see all the different sciences represented around the ring. And these bubbles actually represent competencies, areas of research that you are focusing on right now at this university. This one is, I think, the largest one, and this is, of course, an area that you have a global strength in from Khon Kaen University. The bubbles that are at the most outer ring are very specialized and very pure research areas. The more you get into this inside of the ring, the more multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary they become. To take one of these bubbles, you see this, it's a distinct competency, so you have excelled in this particular competency, and it also shows the number of articles that are published in that particular competency and the authors and so forth. So it gives you quite a nice source of information, really. Some history about the company. It's a very old company that started as a book printer back in the 1600s in Leiden, and it would publish about 3 to 4 books a year. Some of the most important books that were published were texts that are still used today, actually, as foundational texts in the sciences. Since then, we have moved on, and I must say, I am based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. This is the headquarters of Elsevier. But we also have offices in New York, in Oxford, smaller offices in Beijing and Singapore and so forth. So we're very much a global company. Some examples of the many, many journals that we publish. I am sure that you recognize some of these titles that you might be using through the library. Some titles, or most titles, are owned by Elsevier, but we also publish titles on behalf of societies, institutes, and sometimes we host these titles as well on our database, Science Direct. Okay, this gives you a small picture of what I do on a day-to-day basis as a publisher. So first of all, I contact the best possible editors-in-chief around the world at the different universities. They are the experts in their field, and we try and track these people so that they will edit the journal, and they will represent the journal outside of in their field, in their field of expertise as well. They are supported by editorial boards, and I hope that some of the editorial board members that are working on our journals are here today, because it's always a delight to see people in person. If you think about the 1 million articles that are submitted to Elsevier journals every year, it requires a lot of management. All these submissions come in, and the administration of this is huge. It's extensive, really. So we have electronic submission systems. We have different ways of administering all these articles. Then it goes into the peer review process. I will discuss this a little bit in more detail, what this entails, so what you can expect from a peer review process. Through the peer review process, the million articles that we receive, about 350 to 385,000 articles will be accepted, and the rest will all be rejected, and they will have to find another place to publish in. So it's a lot of sorting as well. Of course, then there's editing and preparation, which is making sure that the manuscript is in the correct format and is displayed correctly, and that all the information there has already been placed in a particular order. The production, that is, of course, making sure that the copy will be digitized as well as a printed version of the article in the printed journal. And then it's published and most importantly disseminated, so it is made sure that all of the subscribers receive copies of these journals and articles so that people can use your research. Finally, archiving and promotion. Archiving, of course, so that not only next year after publication people can read your article, but also 50 years from now, or 100 or 200 years from now, just like Galileo. If you have important research, you want to see this way into the future so that everybody can still absorb the research you have done. A small idea of the publishing, the commercial publishers and the more specialized publishers in the world. Elsevier has the largest share holds the largest share of publications, followed by Wiley, Blackwell, and Springer. And then you have some more society publishers or specialized publishers as well. And you can see Elsevier represents all of the research areas. I think it's a nice picture because it also shows the size of the research areas. Life sciences is much bigger in the world than, for example, the social sciences. However, we try and represent that in the best possible way. Some trends in publishing. When I started with the company, we published everything in print. This is the only way that was at that time available, and it was a very slow process. It took a long time to do anything really, but things got accomplished. Now, this is 2012, but I would say 2013, 95% of what we publish is available electronically. So it's a switch completely to electronic environment. And I would say that the 5% that is missing here to make it 100% is really based on some of the older books that we have that were never digitized. But that is also being looked at because some of these texts are very valuable as well. I already mentioned the electronic submission system. Now this is a much more efficient way, of course, of getting the submissions in, managing the submissions, and then also publishing the submissions. There are a lot of experimental models currently out there, including open access. I'm sure you've all heard of this. There is various different versions of open access. There is the paid for by the author open access. There is a sponsored open access where there is an institute that will pay for you. Or sometimes there's free open access as well. Elsevier investigates and tries to work with all these models to see what suits each community best, because I think there's a difference between each community and what is needed. For example, in mathematics and computer sciences, open access is not of that much of interest, whereas in the life sciences, people think this is the best way to publish. These are some of the journals that are currently full open access that we publish. And as I mentioned here, there is also a lot of journals that are a hybrid model of open access. So either the library pays or the author can choose to publish open access if he or she is accepted in the journal. Okay, now we get into more of the details of how you can actually successfully publish your paper. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you will first turn to Google and say, oh, let me see what kind of literature is already out there. What has been done, what has been published on in my particular field of research. Well, make sure that you also know exactly what is available from your librarian, because your librarian will have a lot of databases and a lot of sources of information that will be verified, so they will be validated. The sources at Google don't necessarily have validated information. So it might be research, but it's never been looked at by other researchers to verify that it is correct or maybe incorrect. So be careful how you choose your sources. Some practical advice. In a previous presentation, somebody said, okay, there's a lot of researchers in the world, there's increasing number of researchers in the world. How do I choose what topic to work on? Well, that's a very interesting question. It's a very difficult question as well. And one small piece of advice I would say is look at some of the hot topics. Look at some of the emerging topics in the world. There is numerous sources that show where there's new research being done and where you could possibly look at that particular area to focus on yourself. There is, of course, ways to evaluate which sources you want to use, but also which journals you would like to actually publish in. And I will get into this more later because this is more on the metrics side. And finally, also, more about the journals themselves. They all have home pages. They all have a lot of information on there. Do look at them. Evaluate them ahead of time. Okay, so this is a slide on not only you trying to find other researchers, but how do researchers find you throughout the world? Well, in Scopus, for example, and I know you have access to this database, each author has a profile. So it's identified by the name and also by the number of articles published, 144 in this case, and also the references to those articles. So I think that's 2,100 references. So Professor Siti Haborn, if I am pronouncing this correctly, has quite an impressive record, and this person is actually at Konkan here, so Faculty of Medicine. You can also see that this person is also known by various names, and I'd like to show you that you have to be careful that the name you use as a researcher is a name that you will always stick to. So regardless of whether you get married and maybe assume your husband's name as a woman, or if you use your abbreviation of your first names and so forth, make sure that it's always the same, because then people will be able to find you much easier. And there is no they don't need to distinguish between the two or three names that you might have assumed. Project ORCID looks at that, and it actually consolidates all the information from each researcher. This is a project that is being done by a lot of publishers, but also by universities and administrators at the universities to make sure that each person gets a unique ID and is always known by this particular ID, which is a lot easier, especially when you think about common names like Smith in English language, or Kim in Korea, or Lee in China. Sometimes there's 50 Lees, for example, at one institute, and they all have about the same initials, so which one are you looking for? This is an idea of what happens then. So this person has picked up his or her page in Scopus, but this is also done by other databases. And in this case, Professor Smith has to look at all the current articles that are allocated to his name. Some of these articles might actually not be his, so he has to make sure that those are taken out of the record. But alternately, some of the articles that he has published might not be included, so he has to make sure that those are actually included in his list of publications. And then finally, he receives this ID, unique ID, so that everybody can always find him under that particular ID if they're looking for him. With a number of the increasing number of researchers around the world, I think this is very important, I think. Okay, so this is some of the metrics I was previously mentioning. The H index, of course, is something that came about by Professor Hirsch. And Professor Hirsch wanted to look at the individual researcher and value how well they were doing citation-wise. And he took two unique numbers: the number of papers this person has published versus the number of citations by those papers, and he takes the median here. So, for example, this person has published 20 papers with 20 citations, then the H index would be 20. It's a very simple metric, I think. Of course, there's also something like the impact factor. I think this is something that is always looked at, especially by administrators at the universities, to evaluate what journal is higher ranked and so forth than another one. I don't think I need to go into too much detail about this because most people know how an impact factor is calculated. But do keep in mind that the impact factor for different areas is also different. So, for example, for the fundamental life sciences here, you see that the impact factor is about an average of 3.2. That's average. Whereas in the area I work in, if a journal has an impact factor of 0.5, they think, oh, this is okay, this is good. So compare it within the field, I would say. Now, having said that, there's other metrics, of course, to look at, ones that are quite interesting to analyze and evaluate journals. Schemago journal ranking, SJR, that's more on a prestige level. So it looks at the prestige of one particular journal and ranks that against the other ones. So, for example, Cell or Nature will be very highly ranked, and the European Journal of Cell Biology, blah, blah, will be ranked quite low. Source normalized impact per paper, SNP, that's a more contextual way of evaluating. So it really looks at that particular field and that particular field only. So only those journals in biology or those journals in chemistry, and it doesn't take the other ones into consideration. Through Scopus, once again, you can click on the analytics button here, and you can actually choose a whole bunch of, you can search on a particular journal, and then choose a couple to compare the journals against each other. There's the SJR way, there's the SNP way, and there's also some of the other ones like not cited, so that you can really look at what a journal's doing. It's important to objectively look at the journals in different ways, because then you can see here, for example, that even though Cell is ranked second in impact factor and SJR, when you look at SNP, it's ranked first. So it becomes a little bit more balanced view of how a journal is actually doing. Okay, so before you write your article, of course you have a reason why you've done this research and why you want to get this article published. Perhaps you want to get funding for something, or you're trying to finish your degree. That's probably true for a lot of you here. Perhaps you want to get promoted because there's better jobs, or there's a new university that you want to apply for. Well, whatever your reason, the editors and reviewers that you are going to submit to are not going to know this, because they don't know you personally. So just be careful that even though you have this high expectation, they're not going to know about this, and there is a way to let them know, and I will get into that as well later. Do keep in mind, before you write your article, your paper, it is your passport to the community. This is your identity to your community. And a thought question. So when you're reading papers, you can probably tell already by reading a paper whether it's an okay paper, a poor paper, or whether it's an excellent paper, because it captures your attention. And I will tell you a little bit more about how to not go for the poor one, but go for the excellent article, so that you get your research published in the best possible way. So how do you determine if you're ready to publish? Well, this is really the form in which you want to work in. So if you're presenting new or original results or methods, then I think you are ready to publish. Maybe you're rationalizing or looking into more details and trying to work out something that somebody has previously worked on. That could also be a reason to publish. And then finally, reviewing or summarizing a field, which is usually done by more senior researchers, could also be a reason to publish. I should say that reviewing or summarizing a field is something that a lot of people are invited to do and not necessarily do out of their own will. So this is more something that an editor will say, Professor so-and-so, I think you are the best possible candidate to survey this field because you have been working in this field for a very long time. So if you're ready to publish, what you need, of course, is a very strong manuscript. So what is a strong manuscript? Well, it has to be novel, so new. It has to be clear. It has to be of use to others. And of course, it has to be exciting, and not exciting as in, wow, great, woohoo, but it has to be something that you feel excited about and that you think other researchers will also be excited about. Of course, it has to be presented in a logical manner, just like you are doing your research, which is very logical steps. You want to construct the paper in a logical way. And of course, reviewers and editors, first of all, have to understand what it is your research was about, why this is important to their subject field. Do remember, editors and reviewers are really busy, just like you are. They're not only working on their own research, they don't only have their own teaching responsibilities, they are also looking after a journal. So they have very little time, so make their time worth it. This is a summary of what I already discussed about the types of research that you would be publishing. So a full-length article, a letter, or a review paper. So the difference between the full-length article and the letter is really, a full-length article is a piece of research that has already been thought out carefully and from start to finish, and it warrants a full-length paper. However, if you have something where you find something new and you think it's really exciting and you want to submit this quickly so that the rest of the community can hear about this, then perhaps a letter is more appropriate because it's a quicker communication between you and your research community. Do ask, especially younger people around here, do ask your supervisor and your colleagues where they feel that this piece of research should sit. Should it be a full-length article, or should it be more considered more of a letter? So then you have to also think about the audience. Who are you writing to? And let's be clear that each community in the scientific world has a different way of communicating. It's very subtle, but it's different. So if you know who you're writing to, then you can be much clearer in what you want to say, whether you want to be conciser in one area and more lengthy in another area or so forth. But do keep your audience in mind at all time. And of course, is the paper of a local interest or of an international interest? Keep that in mind as well. Because even though you might have done a local study, it might be of international importance. So try and make that transition yourself so that your readers will understand why it is of international importance. Choosing the right journal. Well, you get a lot of people that say, oh, my first article, I will submit it to Nature. Good luck. It's, of course, if you really think that the research you have done can be accepted by such a high-ranking journal, a journal that receives thousands and thousands of really good submissions a year, then by all means go for it. However, if you feel that your research is top, but not quite for such a broad journal, then do look at the top journals in the field-specific area. So look at the ones that are specialized in your area. And subsequently, also look at the more, maybe not prestigious ones, but the ones that are still well-known out there. Don't make this mistake by first aiming really high and then going down lower, lower, lower. Be realistic about where your research sits in the environment of all these journals. So this is just an example of one of the journals I publish. And you can see that there is quite a description about what this journal, the type of articles this journal accepts, on which fields it accepts it in. And it gives information about the editor-in-chief and the editorial board. It gives you a good idea what type of community is behind this journal. It also gives you an idea of the types of articles that are already published here. So then you can evaluate whether this would be the right place for you to submit to. Do ask, once again, your supervisors. They're going to know, most likely, because they have experience in this. They might have made this mistake of submitting to Nature first, or maybe they've been very reasonable and thought about this carefully, and they're intelligent, and I'm sure they are, actually. The references you have used in your article are likely also to be given good indication of the type of journal that you would want to submit your article to, because obviously you're doing the research in this area and you have not chosen those journals for nothing. please don't gamble on submitting your article to more than one journal at the same time. So only submit one to one journal. If you get accepted, then great. If you get rejected, then move on to the next one. It's not ethical, and in fact, a lot of the editors or reviewers will find out quite quickly that, hey, wait a second, you have submitted to my journal, but I hear from a colleague that you're also submitting to this other journal. That's not right. I think you can all appreciate that a fish is very tasty, but this is where the most meat sits. So I think this is a nice representation of, you first see the head, of course, of a fish, the title, the abstract, and the keywords, which are used in abstracting and indexing databases to find your article, so that you will, the researchers in your area will be able to find your article easily. Of course, then you get the main text, the body of your work, where you show your experiments, you describe your methods, and so forth. And finally, the conclusion, the tail needs to be included, of course, as well, the references, the acknowledgments, and so forth. It says your journal space is not unlimited. I would say that is a statement about the length of an article versus what is needed to express what your research is about. So if you can write an article of 20 pages versus an article of 50 pages, it is more likely that it will actually be read, because people don't have unlimited amount of time to read everything. I wish we did, but then it'd be very slow research. Okay, so this gives you an idea of the writing process. Here you see that, of course, you start with the title and you finish with the tail, with the conclusions and acknowledgments and so forth. Well, the writing is just the other way around, where, of course, you gather your data first and you make sure that everything is there, it's consolidated, and all the figures and tables are correct and so forth. Then you look at the methods, the results, and discussion. You write that. Then you write your conclusion and your introduction. And finally, you look at your title and abstract and keywords. That's done in the last bit. That's the last thing you will do. I get questions about this quite often. So, do publishers actually correct language? And the answer is no. And why? Because if we correct language, then some of the things that you have said in your paper might actually be incorrectly changed to mean something completely different. So, by all means, you as an author are responsible for making the language as clear as possible in your paper. So the publisher will not look at the language. It will check the grammar and some of the spelling perhaps, but it will not change, alter the sentences, because the sentence structure is sometimes very important for a particular meaning to be understood by other researchers. There are, of course, services that are offered, including from Elsevier, but I would also say that do ask colleagues around you that are native English speakers to look at your paper. Use those as resources as well. And if you're collaborating with an international author, and that author is actually a native English speaker, then most likely you will be sharing that workload in that way, where he or she actually corrects the language as you go along. So scientific language is, of course, very specific. It's not, it has to be clear, it has to be objective, it has to be accurate. And of course, it has to be short. And I say short in the sense that it has to be as concise as possible. In order to be successful, of course, use the English language correctly. I mean, I think that's understood. That's very clear. Check for grammar and punctuation. There is very good tools, of course, that are for free or that you can already use on your computer. Or once again, look at some colleagues or peers that will be able to help you with this. Construct sentences simply. I mean, don't try to incorporate too much in one sentence, because if you reread your own work and you don't understand it, then I don't think anybody else will either, so keep this in mind. Reasons why this is so important. You are writing a lot of abstract concepts, and therefore it needs very precise writing. If you're not going to be there to describe or to support your work, you have to be very careful in how you write things down, because you're not going to be able to say, pick up the phone and say, oh, I saw that you were reading my article. Let me explain a couple of things. This is not possible in the international world. It would be lovely to do that, but no one wants to read pages and pages of formulae or of text descriptions, reiterations of things. Therefore, once again, brevity. So condense it as much as possible. Be very precise and concise. Why is language important? Another slide I would say, which I think is always quite shocking. Editors and reviewers don't want to guess what you mean, especially the editor receives your work, and then this editor, who is quite an outspoken person, I would say, he said, trying to understand this, I don't understand because it looks like it's garbage. And in fact, there's 6 grammatical errors already in the abstract, let alone in the rest of the text. So I didn't even look at it. And he says, don't waste my time. So it's a very clear message. And this is why some people are not successful in getting published, because their ideas might be good, but they cannot write their ideas down correctly, and in a way that is understood by the editor, first of all, who is the gatekeeper to the journal, and then subsequently to the reviewers, and so forth. So sentences, please write them as short as possible. 6 to 9 words, I think, is probably the guideline I would like to give you. Then it's very clear what you're trying to say. Avoid using more than one piece of information per sentence. So one idea is more than enough per sentence. And certainly also multiple statements are not needed in a sentence. This is one long sentence here as an example. Now, I invite the author of this to understand what he or she said here, because nobody I have spoken to actually knows what is being conveyed here, and it's just one sentence. It's not a good idea. On authorship, so of course there is international rules about who becomes an author of a paper and who does not. There is 3 conditions that need to be met. So the author of a paper needs to substantially have contributed to the paper. The draft and the revised article has to be seen by this person, and the person has to give approval of the final version sent to the publisher, to the editor, for submission. If all those 3 conditions are met, then it's an acknowledged individual, so an acknowledged author. There is, of course, an order that is quite commonly used, and I realize that in some research areas this is slightly different, but this is a general rule. There's the first author that conducts and supervises everything, and then finally puts the paper together. Then there is the corresponding author, and this person tends to be the one that also communicates with the publisher and the editor. Do avoid ghost and gift authors. So ghost authors are those authors that are not acknowledged in the paper, but however they have actually contributed to the research and the paper itself. And gift authors are those that somebody said, oh, I really like this person, put him on the paper. You know, he'll appreciate that we have included him. But they're not actually authors. They didn't do anything. So don't do this. It's not good. Then we get into the title. So to make a good title, it has to be short and it has to be informative, because this is, of course, your way of describing your whole article in one sentence. Identify the topic of the paper. Begin with the subject of the paper as well. Of course, it has to be accurate. It has to be unambiguous and specific. And don't use any rarely used abbreviations. So things that you might have come up with and that might be described in the paper, but in the title, nobody's going to understand what they mean. If possible, try and be as short and concise as possible, because they're going to be the ones, those titles are going to be the ones that are picked up most quickly if somebody looks at an overview and they will say, oh, this is a nice title, click on it. It might not even be relevant, but those are the titles that are clicked on most often. My guideline to you is try not to exceed one line of text for an article title. Some of the examples and some of the phrases you want to avoid. So preliminary observations on, well, it's unnecessary to say that they are preliminary observations. You don't have to say this in a title. Just state the topic. Partial results towards a proof of, well, it's accurate, but still unnecessary. Don't start your title with these types of things. And here is a title with all these different abbreviations and jargon that is specific to that paper. It's not going to mean anything to anybody until they read the paper. I asked one of my editors to come up with a couple of titles which he thought were quite catchy. Paths, trees, and flowers. Well, paths and trees are actually terms used in combinatorics and mathematics. So paths, trees, and flowers make sense. And in fact, it was picked up very quickly by the colleagues because they were all curious what the flowers meant. A method in graph theory. Now, that's very accurate title. It's very short and it's also very accurate. You do have titles like this, mangoes and blueberries, and packing seagulls. These are the types of titles where people say, what? These are inside jokes by the authors, and yes, they are very good articles, and the authors know what they mean, but only when you know the authors will you understand what they're talking about, so then it's not being picked up by anybody else outside this community. The abstract. So now you're saying to your reader, these are the most important things that I have actually discovered. Abstract is, of course, also included in the abstracting and database, abstracting and indexing services. So all these things are being picked up and people can freely access this wherever they are. Yeah, it is an advertisement for your article, really. It says, come see me. You want to read this. This is exciting research. In this abstract, as you can see here, what has been done is the first part, and what are the main findings is in the second part. It's very clear. It's one paragraph, short, descriptive. It's very well used. Keywords, of course, are also included in the abstracting and indexing layer of the database. And they're really also labels for your manuscript. Do only use abbreviations that are known and understood by the rest of the community. Don't use any abbreviations that you might have come up yourself or that are rarely used. And yes, check the guide for authors, because the guide for authors of one particular journal might say, please use this specific format for keywords or this particular database or tree. Here you have a couple of titles and the keywords that they have used, going from quite generic to quite specific. It describes the article nicely, actually. Then you get into the introduction. And of course, this is when you want to convince your reader that, in fact, yes, this is the article that he or she will read from start to finish and get all excited about. So you get from very generic questions like what is a problem and existing solutions, and they get into much more specifics. What are you hoping to achieve, and what are the limitations? So write it in that way. The methods and experiments follow. It includes all the important details so that what the reader can actually do is recreate your experiment if this is relevant to your article. So it can only be unambiguous what you have done. Do give the vendor names and the chemical compounds that you might have used or the chemical names. Present the proper control experiments, and don't add any comments or discussions here. This is purely the experiment you're describing. Write in the past tense. I think that's also important because you have done the experiment already. And here you can consider supplementary materials which follow at the end of an article, but will not actually be published with the printed version of the article. It will only be published with the electronic version. From the ethics community, you have to, of course, receive approval if you're doing experiments with humans or animals. There's international standards that have to be met, and the international standards are unambiguous. So make sure that you adhere to all of them, the Helsinki Declaration. Editors might have questions about this, of course, and they might still question whether what you have done is ethical, but okay, that's for another discussion. So then you get into the results. What have you found? You only include the main findings. So don't get into much detail here, just the main findings of your research. And how do they differ from findings that you or your colleagues might have previously published, so that you can make a distinction between the two or more? And of course, if there's unexpected findings, maybe negative results, also include this here. Of course, you also have to do your statistical analysis here, and I think somebody asked me the other day, so which actual software package do I use? What is accepted? Once again, look at the guide for authors for a journal, and they will give you guidelines on which is, commonly used in that journal. And it's usually more than one. The results, of course, can also be shown and displayed in figures and tables. Illustrations are very important because they tell a lot more than how you could possibly describe it in words. Do remember that the captions and legends have to be detailed so that it's clear where this fits in with the text. And of course, no duplication of results should be described in the text, because that's not necessary. And that avoids you being very lengthy as well in your article. Appearance does count. This is, I think, always a nice illustration of where the author, wrote his or her text in English and then forgot that there was a little label here, I think in Chinese. So any other author is not going to understand, or any reader is going to understand what this means. I don't even know what this picture is, but this one here, it says drug crystals, and it just points at two things, and okay, maybe the author should have used color here or zoomed in more to really show exactly what these drug crystals, what they look like, because this is not very clear. When I say color, only use color where it's necessary, so where it enhances the picture and where it makes it clearer what you're trying to say with your figure or your illustration. And yeah, don't include long, boring tables, so with long lists of data and so forth. So that you get into the discussion. So what are the results and what do they actually mean? Then you get into how this could possibly be a new finding in your field. Check for the following. So, did your results relate to the original question or not? So, did you provide any interpretation of each result? And are they consistent with what the other investigators have reported? If not, then explain why. Are there any limitations to what you have done and what you want to do? And most importantly, do not make any statements that go beyond the results that you are displaying. So then it won't be followed by anybody reading your article anymore. Conclusion. So present the global and specific conclusions here. Possibly some of the uses and extensions of what you have been doing, not you yourself in later experiments, but possibly maybe your colleagues want to pick up on this. And just make sure you don't summarize the paper here. You have already said what you wanted to say in all the other parts of the paper, so this is just a conclusion part. Lastly, sometimes people say, oh, so this is where I say that my results and my experiment are going to impact the world in such a big way. I want to say this here. Well, let the reader decide that for themselves, okay? Acknowledgments. So all of those people that might have worked on the paper, but they're not really authors, you need to acknowledge them here. You need to thank them for the time and effort. These can be advisors, of course. Sometimes if you have received financial support, you should certainly include people here. Sometimes proofreaders or people that have corrected your English or looked at some of your research. These are the people that you want to acknowledge here. References, get them right. Well, references, get them in one particular format, I would say, is more precise. So be consistent in how you state your references. Most publishers nowadays will take your references, and if they're in the one correct style, they will make sure that the references are then changed into the format of that particular journal. So don't worry too much about the format for that journal that you're submitting to, but just make sure that they are always in the right way. What you want to avoid here is communications, like personal communications between you and maybe a colleague, or unpublished observations, or possibly if something was published in a local language. Essentially, you're writing to an international audience, so you want to make sure that all of the work that you have used is also can also be read and understood by them. So if they look at the references, they will be able to click on this and say, okay, well, then I will look at this to see why they use this as a reference. If it is in a local language, a lot of people are not going to understand it. So avoid that if possible. If it's necessary, then it's necessary. But if there's an English or, if there's an English version, please use that. Supplementary material, of course, it's of secondary importance. But if you feel that it is going to support your article, please do use it. It can be audio or video as well. But just keep in mind that it only supports it in a secondary way because it will not be included in the printed version of the journal. Okay, this is a suggested length of each part of your paper. I would say this is where you look at the guide for authors once again to see if this particular journal has a page limit. If the journal says, do not send me articles that are longer than 20 pages, please make sure that you don't do this, because likely the editor will say, oh, 25 pages. Reject. So it's wasting your time, but it's also wasting the editor's time. This is just a list of approximate numbers of pages, so don't take it too hard, please. And do remember that letters and short communications, of course, are, once again, short communications are shorter, and therefore the page limit will be much shorter, maybe 3 to 5 pages at most. Abbreviations, if you're going to use abbreviations, then make sure that you describe the abbreviation first, after which you can use it throughout the rest of the article. But also, if you're going to use abbreviation in the abstract, also describe it there. And if you're going to use a particular term only once, then you don't need to abbreviate it, because then obviously it's never going to be used again in the article. If there are abbreviations, of course, that are firmly established in the world, and I think DNA is one of the most commonly used ones, then yes, of course, you don't have to describe that. But otherwise, please describe what the abbreviation is. So before you submit, you have written your article, you've finished it, it's on your desk, or it's on your laptop. Put it away for a couple of days. Look at it again, and then start rewriting, because you're likely to find that some of the things that you said before might be written in a different and a more concise way. And then you do that again, because you have to write and rewrite and sometimes rewrite again in order to make it as clear as possible. Do ask once again your peers, your colleagues here, but also your supervisor. I think this is one of the most important jobs of a supervisor in this stage, to evaluate the paper then and say, okay, I like it the way it is, or maybe you should change this, or maybe you should expand on this a little bit more. This cover letter, or sometimes it's a text box if you're submitting electronically, is your chance to say, dear Professor so-and-so, I am a PhD student, and this is a paper that will get me my degree. There's no guarantees here, but this is the place to actually say, maybe the reason that you're publishing or you're trying to get published is this is the place to actually say this. Submit it along with your manuscript, so that you can actually mention why this is so important to the journal and why you chose this particular journal to submit your publication to. If there are special requirements, then please mention them here as well. And special requirements can be reviewers that you might suggest for your paper. sometimes the editor will say, oh, great, this person has given me these reviewers. Yes, I will send the paper to these reviewers because that's a great suggestion. However, some editors will say, thank you, these are your friends. I will not send your paper to these reviewers because they're likely to say, this is a great paper, and they will not be critical enough. So this is a cover letter, and it says here, the final approval from all of the authors are met, of course, because this is the Vancouver convention style. The explanation and the importance of the research is stated here as well. And then below here are the suggested reviewers that this corresponding author has given. So, you're ready to submit. You've done it. Yeah. This is what it might feel like. But I want to make sure that you get an idea of what goes on behind the scenes, because people are not as harsh as this, I hope. Here's an overview of what really happens behind when you submit. So you as an author, you submit your paper to a journal, and it goes to the editor, and the editor looks at the requirements and says, oh, great, everything is met, you have given me all the information that is needed. Or maybe not everything is there, then it will be rejected, but it will be asked by the editor to submit again with all the requirements. Sometimes editors already look and say, oh, but I don't understand why this author tried my journal, because this is out of scope. This is not what we publish at all in this journal. So that might also be a reason to reject immediately. However, if everything is met and the topic seems appropriate to the journal, then the editor will either assign it directly to reviewers, or sometimes ask an associate editor or an editorial board to look at it and then once again submit it to the reviewers. Now, in each scientific discipline, there is a rule of thumb about the number of reviewers that are asked. Now, for example, in pure mathematics, it tends to be just one reviewer that is asked to review. But sometimes in the life sciences and biological sciences, maybe 5 or 6 reviewers are asked to look at one article. So it all depends on which discipline you're working in. So then the reviewer looks at the paper and gives a recommendation. Now, typically, all of these are collected, and then the editor will make a decision. And it is the editor that makes the final decision on whether a paper is accepted, rejected, or a revision is required. The reviewers only recommend. The editor makes her decision, and yay, here you get accepted. Well, maybe not, but we'll look at that. Mostly, either papers get rejected because they are, the quality possibly is not of a particular standard that the journal is looking for, or maybe the type of research is too local and not of an international enough interest. But a lot of the papers actually go for revision, because then the editor and the reviewers will suggest all these different types of revisions to improve the paper, and then the author is asked to resubmit or revise the paper and then go back to the editor. Yeah, accepted. Well, if you are accepted on the first go, then I would say have a party, have a big party with the rest of your department, because it's very rare, but it does happen sometimes that papers are accepted immediately for a journal. Rejected, well, this is more common, and I'm sure that everybody in their career gets rejected many times for different reasons. Don't despair, it happens to everybody, just remember that. And try to understand why, because sometimes the editor will give you extra feedback, or the reviewers have given all of their feedback as well, and read why they feel that the paper is not accepted in this journal. Be critical, be self-critical in this case, and then consider that you are submitting to another journal, for example. Start the whole process over again. Look at the type of journal you want to publish in, look at the aims and scope again, look at the requirements of that journal, and then restructure the paper accordingly. But the advice by the reviewers, take that to heart, because this is a couple of people that have looked at your paper in a very critical manner, but in a constructive manner as well. So take this in consideration. Rejection is not the end of the world. It might feel like that for maybe a couple of days, and you can sit down and cry a little bit, but your research is worth much more than that, of course, because you know why it's worth publishing. So then go back and revise it and rewrite it again to make it much better again, once again, and take what the reviewers and the editor have said to heart as well. There is, of course, a large portion of people that will get the message back from the editor saying, okay, we'd like you to revise this manuscript. Now, there's two types of revision. There's a minor revision where basically, you know, the editor thinks that it's acceptable, the research is done correctly and so forth, but there's some small little pieces of information that need to be changed. There's also major revision where it really, the article needs a lot of reworking in order to become in the best possible shape for it to be published. Likely, you're not going to find that the editor will say, yes, dear author, thank you, this is a minor revision or this is a major revision. They're not going to say this. But the length of the different changes are going to give you an idea of whether it's a minor or a major revision. And do remember, even if it's a minor revision, it's still not a guarantee that it will be published after all. The editor might change his or her decision at the last moment for whatever reason. Manuscript revision, do cherish the chance to even better your work here. When you prepare your response letter, so taking all the different pieces of advice from the reviewers, make very clear notes of exactly where you have incorporated this in your manuscript. And there might actually be a couple of pieces of advice that they have given you where you say, I don't actually agree with this because it's going to alter my research. Then also give that response. Make sure that you tell them why you're not taking their advice here. Talk to them. Make sure that they understand why you're doing this. Do yourself a favor here, though, and you have spent weeks and months and sometimes even years preparing this research, so take the time to revise your manuscript. Okay, so then we get into, you have done all of this, you have submitted your manuscript and it gets accepted and so forth. So what is not done in the publishing world, in the research world? Certainly, I think it is becoming increasingly a threat that people are unethically publishing. Sometimes they are plagiarizing, sometimes there's falsification of data that they are publishing, and sometimes they're even hiring other people to write their manuscripts. For publishers and for editors, this phenomenon is increasing quite exponentially actually right now, so it's a real threat to the science world. These are some of the ideas that some of the cases of misconduct that you can think of. So the fabrication of data or cases, the willful falsification of data, plagiarism, not getting ethical approval for something, not admitting if there is missing data, for example, that's another one, and so forth. And even though it says from serious to less serious, sometimes even these types of unethical behavior are very, very serious because they have huge implications on research. We have a couple of electronic tools that we use. Turnitin is used specifically for universities, so the university will look and evaluate your work against a database. And Authenticate is used mainly by editors and publishers to look at a submission and hold it against a database of more than 20 million articles and see where certain pieces of text have already been used by somebody else. Of course, with any type of electronic tool, it always requires human eyes to determine whether it is actually in fact plagiarism or not. So it's not a guarantee that even if it says that 80% of somebody's article has already been published in other pieces of information. In social sciences, for example, it might mean that this is a formal language that they're using that is commonly used in other articles as well, but that's not plagiarism. Plagiarism is falsifying somebody or using somebody else's work. Do remember that aside from the electronic tools, of course, there is your peers, your colleagues that are looking at your data as well and your research, and they might be the ones that say, I don't think this person was responsible for this. I didn't see them doing this type of research. There's people in every corner of the world looking at this, and most of the people that do plagiarize or do falsify are actually found out. And they might be young researchers, they might be senior researchers, and they might be so senior sometimes that they actually make the news. This is a German minister that had received his doctorate in a very unethical manner. And he was thrown out of parliament, and I don't know actually what he's doing now, but I don't think it's going to be much to do with politics or research anymore. Down here we have a Dutch researcher that was recently found out, Diederik Stapel. Diederik, he falsified all of his data for pretty much 115 of his articles. And he was thrown out of the university, doesn't have his professorship anymore, of course, and I sincerely hope that he will find something else and something better to do in his life. Retraction notice to say that in this case, the article has been retracted at the request of the editor-in-chief, and some of the reasons for that. And this big retraction sign gets put up on there. People will still be able to find this article, but they will see that, in fact, this researcher was unethical in his or her way of publishing, and his research is not correct. So it stays available into perpetuity as well. So data fabrication and falsification, which is what Professor Stapel did, making up data or results. Well, this can be very harmful, of course, because if you think about somebody in the medical sciences doing this, it could have implications on doctors prescribing medicine, and it could actually kill people as well. I mean, that's the worst case, of course, but yeah. Finally, what does lead to acceptance? Attention to details. Make sure that everything is is done in a methodological way. You do this as researchers anyway, so make sure that you do this for your article as well. Check and double check your work. Make sure that you consider all the reviewers' and editors' comments that are made. Your English must be as good as possible, please, so that it's clear to everybody what your research is about. The presentation, of course, is important. Take your time to revise and revise again, perhaps, and rewrite. Acknowledge all those people that have been working with you and have helped you in your career and in your research. Do make sure that what you publish is new, original, and not previously published work. Be critical about evaluating your manuscript, and all ethical rules have to be obeyed. That is not a national thing, that's an international thing. This is some further reading. I believe you will get a copy of the presentation afterwards, so don't worry about this. You can look at some of the links and some of the sites that are going to be helpful for you, also on the use of English language and so forth. I'd like to thank you all for coming here today. Last but not least, there is a site for you for young researchers called Bigger Brains that will have a lot of this information on there that you can look back on as well, some video and some sound bites as well. And if you have any questions, this is the time for it. If you have any questions afterwards when you come back and think about something else, do email me. I will respond, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.